I, you know, if you gotta do a job, do it yourself. I wanted to address you guys directly because over the last day and a half, obviously, there's been all sorts of controversy around the incident that happened in Cambridge with Professor Gates and the police department there. I actually just had a conversation with Sergeant Jim Crawley, the officer involved, and I have to tell you that, as I said yesterday, my impression of him was that he was an outstanding police officer and a good man, and that was confirmed in the phone conversation, and I told him that. Because this has been ratcheting up, and I obviously helped to contribute ratcheting it up, I want to make clear that in my choice of words, I think I unfortunately gave an impression that I was maligning the Cambridge Police Department or Sergeant Crawley specifically. And I could have calibrated those words differently. And I told this to Sergeant Crawley. I continue to believe, based on what I have heard, that there was an overreaction in pulling Professor Gates out of his home to the station. I also continue to believe, based on what I heard, that Professor Gates probably overreacted as well. My sense is you've got two good people in a circumstance in which neither of them were able to resolve the incident in the way that it should have been resolved and the way they would have liked it to be resolved. The fact that it has garnered so much attention, I think, is a testimony to the fact that these are issues that are still very sensitive here in America. So to the extent that my choice of words didn't illuminate, but rather contributed to more media frenzy, I think that was unfortunate. What I'd like to do then is make sure that everybody steps back for a moment, recognizes that these are two decent people, not extrapolate too much from the facts, but as I said at the press conference, be mindful of the fact that because of our history, because of the difficulties of the past, African Americans are sensitive to these issues. And even when you've got a police officer who has a fine track record on racial sensitivity, interactions between police officers and the African American community can sometimes be fraught with misunderstanding. My hope is that as a consequence of this event, this ends up being what's called a teachable moment, where all of us, instead of pumping up the volume, spend a little more time listening to each other and try to focus on how we can generally improve relations between police officers and minority communities, and that instead of flinging accusations, we can all be a little more reflective in terms of what we can do to contribute to more unity. Lord knows we need it right now, because over the last 2 days, as we've discussed this issue, I don't know if you've noticed, but nobody's been paying much attention to health care. I will not use this time to spend more words on health care, although I can't guarantee that that will be true next week. But I just wanted to emphasize that one last point I guess I'd make. So there are some who say that as president, I shouldn't have stepped into this at all because it's a local issue. I have to tell you that that part of it I disagree with. The fact that this has become such a big issue, I think, is indicative of the fact that race is still a troubling aspect of our society. Whether I were black or white, I think that me commenting on this and hopefully contributing to constructive as opposed to negative understandings about the issue, is part of my portfolio. So at the end of the conversation, there was discussion about my conversation with Sergeant Crawley. There was discussion about he and I and Professor Gates having a beer here in the White House. We don't know if that's scheduled yet, but we may put that together. He also did say he wanted to find out if there was a way of getting the press off his lawn. I informed him that I can't get the press off my lawn. He pointed out that my lawn is bigger than his lawn. But if anybody has any connections to the Boston press as well as national press, Sergeant Crawley would be happy for you to stop trampling his grass. All right? Thank you, guys.
Robert, has he talked to Gates?
Hold on. I have almost all the confidence in the world that whatever I say is not going to make the news tonight. But in my role, I am happy to answer your questions. I actually, Marissa handed me my folder and said the week ahead is in the front pocket. I said I have a sneaking suspicion we'll get to that toward the end. He has not spoken to Professor Gates. No.
Did anybody from the White House reach out to Professor Gates to let him know that the
Not
president was going to do this?
Not that I'm aware of.
Was there any form of apology from the president in the
Well,
conversation?
I think the president characterized most of their conversation as something that he wanted to have with the officer, and I'll keep it that way.
How real was this offer? I mean, he said a beer. I mean, that's one thing you just throw out there, but is it like?
Well, I think
hey,
it was
how
the
about
suggestion of the sergeant, and I think the president in their probably about 5-minute phone conversation.
Is he inviting the sergeant to come to the White House? Is he inviting the sergeant to come to the White House?
Did not hear your last words.
Let him finish.
Where did we leave it?
Your 5-minute conversation.
In about a 5-minute conversation, I had to go back and check my notes. I think it was Sergeant Crowley's suggestion about the beer, and I think the president thought it was a good idea.
You gonna schedule it? I mean, is this a serious?
Well, I think as he said, he doesn't know if it's scheduled, but they'll work on that. I think
is
as the
president.
president.
The
Hold on,
sergeant to the White House, right?
Hold on. You don't have to talk into the microphone. We all heard your question. Again, I think, as the president said, and I think that's why the invitation is a real invitation, is that a moment like this can be used to teach us and be used to have a communication and a dialogue that's constructive outside of the moment.
Robert,
Yes, sir.
when did the president decide to make this phone call, and what prompted him? Was there any particular event or conversation that prompted him to do
None
so?
that I'm aware of. I sometime earlier today, but I don't know the exact time that he decided. The call happened. It lasted about 5 minutes. It was, let's see, my watch is set ahead, so it was probably around just recently, 2:15, 2:20.
After he came back from the education event?
Yes. Yep.
Do you know if he plans to speak with Professor Gates?
I don't know, but I will check on that when we're done. April?
Robert, this is significant that the president had to come back and address a question from a press conference because of its nature, race. What kind of communiques or letters or calls have you gotten here to the White House, and what kind of outpouring have you gotten from the community for the president to make this decision? And did police organizations from around the country help to make this decision for him to come out and make this statement today?
I was on the road yesterday, April, so I don't know what engagement the White House had yesterday with groups or individuals. I think I did see on the correspondence chart that we get that healthcare was the biggest topic again yesterday in terms of comments and concerns, but that's all the information I have on that.
And a follow-up also, since he acknowledges that race is still an issue and there are sensitivities still about race, this issue is proven, is he thinking about possibly doing something along the lines of what Bill Clinton did, possibly having a conversation on race?
Well,
At
I
some
think,
point.
I think in many ways, the question, the answer, the events, I think we're having that conversation. I don't think it's a separate initiative. I don't think it's an announcement. I think the president would say that these are important issues that play out in our daily lives and will and should be discussed in our daily lives. Yes, sir.
From listening to him, it sure sounded like he had made an apology to the officer. Wouldn't it be fair to characterize it as that?
Well, I think he, Steve, I think he understood that, as he told you all, that his words contributed to this being ratcheted up. I mean, I think there's a reason that the news media is on the sergeant's lawn. I think, and he wanted to make sure that, to let him know that that word choice was not one that he thought was probably, in hindsight, the best choice.
Were you in the room during
Yes.
this all? Did you hear him issue an apology or
I'm-
not?
I'm-
Don't make us,
But we're not
parse-
asking
Don't
him.
make us parse this.
We're
No,
not
no,
asking you to
you don't have to
characterize
parse
his
it. You can quote
remarks.
me and you can quote him.
But
You
we're
don't
not
have to
asking
parse.
you to
No, I
characterize
understand.
his remarks. We're asking what you heard.
I feel comfortable with the answer I just gave Steve.
But did you hear him make an apology?
I'm not going to get, if the president doesn't want to characterize in a conversation that he's having with you all, I'm not going to get ahead of him.
Robert?
Yes, sir.
Prior to the president going out for that press conference, obviously you sit down, you go over the questions that are going to be asked for the evening, and you rehearse answers or discuss how he will answer your questions. Did this come up as part of the preparations, the Gates matter? And if so, was this word choice of stupidly, was that ever thrown around in
I'm
preparation?
not going to get
for it?
into the process of all this.
But what was discussed about that question? I mean, when that came up?
I'm not going to get into,
Were you
how
shocked
we-
when the president used those words?
my opinion on that doesn't matter. Yep.
Do you anticipate that there will in fact be a meeting here at the White House? I mean, I know that
I think the president hopes so. I think the
when?
president hopes that, again, that this is a moment that can be used to discuss these issues.
And when do you expect him to reach out to Mr. Gates?
I said I'd check on that, so I don't know the answer to that. Yes, sir.
Robert, what part of his statement would he take back? Anything other than the word stupidly, the president, or?
You know, again, you just heard from the president. I would quote him liberally, and I don't want to get into parsing him. Jonathan?
One quick thing. He said that because of our history, African Americans are sensitive to these issues. I want to make sure he is referring. Is he referring to Mr. Gates or and his response, or is he referring to the president's own response to the issue and to the question at the press
No,
conference?
I think he's talking about. Writ large. I think he's talking about. I don't think there's. I think that statement. Well, I know that statement does not. He's not speaking about an individual situation. He's talking about, and the reason that he came to work on an issue like this in the state Senate was because of historical tension. But that's not an individual thing. That's writ large.
What I mean is, when Lynn Sweet asked the question, he could have dodged it. He jumped into it, and I wonder if he is saying that is because the sensitivity he feels.
Well,
sensitive
I think
to
he
these
addressed
questions.
that up here in saying that he has heard those that said maybe because it was a local issue, it's something that he should have or could have steered around, and I think he was clear on that here.
Robert?
Yes, sir.
Two questions, sir, please. One, as far as healthcare issue is concerned, most of the Indian American physicians and doctors in this country, they support President's initiative. But and also one survey we did also, they approved his 6 months in office in most of the issues. The question is that as far as small businesses are concerned, some of them have concern that how they will pay for the employees, and now as far as the health issue and immigration both are related to them, that they want to hear from the president how they will deal with in the future.
Well, let me address healthcare and small business. Obviously, this is a topic that the president has spent quite a bit of time on throughout the week in meetings with, in town hall meetings, in meetings with with the Blue Dogs in meetings here today. Obviously, millions of businesses are struggling with the high cost, the skyrocketing cost of health insurance. That gets harder and harder each day to provide for their employees. I think one of the things the president wants to see come out of healthcare reform are ideas that will cut costs for small businesses and allow those that are providing insurance for their employees to be able to do so more affordably for themselves, and hopefully encourage others that want to do that but have shied away from it because of the cost to be able to do that as well.
Second, as far as Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's visit to India, what sort of message she was carrying from the president? She's now back and meeting with the president and giving the report. And
Yeah.
do we have a new roadmap as far as U.S.-India relations are concerned in the future?
Well, I have not talked with the Secretary of State. I know the Secretary of State met with the president for lunch today to discuss the trip, but I have not had a chance to discuss that trip. Yep.
What's the lesson? If this is a teachable moment, what does the president want the country to take away from this?
Well, I think as he said yesterday, and I think as he said today, and I think as even he said at the news conference, you had a call come in, and you had an officer respond to a call about a potential break-in. And as I said yesterday as well, there was clearly a point sometime after that where both sides could have stepped back a little bit, and maybe we wouldn't have had all of this play out the way it has. I think he understands the enormity of the job that law enforcement has, and I think he spoke today about the tension that has been there in some African American communities with law enforcement, and that working together in having that dialogue and in communicating, we can make things better for both involved. Yes, sir.
What is he going to do over the next month to try to keep up the momentum of health care?
Well, we'll go through some on the week ahead. I know we've got it. He'll travel on Wednesday to Raleigh, North Carolina, and a not yet picked city in Virginia to continue to discuss healthcare reform and the need to get it done. And I think it is safe to say that we had always assumed the president would continue to talk about this and other important issues like the economy and energy, even while Congress was back at home. So there'll be a busy month of that. Yes, sir.
Isn't it Southwest Virginia? I'm sorry.
It was this morning, and it's now not yet confirmed. So
I've never heard of it. Not yet picked city, Virginia. Is there any place like
it's
that?
Just south of southwestern Virginia. If I knew where it was, Chuck, I would
Can't
have.
raise the region anymore. We should back off.
I would, not unless you can pinpoint not yet confirmed Virginia. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Robert. One of the things that has come up since the president's statement at the news conference that, quote, his health care plan will not add to the deficit, is the letter from 6 days before with the CBO study signed by its director, Doug Elmendorf, who said that the plan, H.R. 3200, if enacted, would add $239 billion to the deficit by 2019. What is the administration's reaction to the CBO scoring?
Well, I don't have anything specific on what they say happens in the 10th year of that 10-year window. I can simply reiterate for you what the president has now said on any number of occasions, that healthcare reform legislation that he signs will not add to the deficit, and then he means that.
So he disagrees with Director
No.
Elmendorf?
Well, why would he? He's not evaluated from a budgetary perspective. HR 3200, that's not his job.
All right. One other question, it's a housekeeping matter. Based on this morning, are you going to restore the gaggle as a permanent part of the briefing?
I look forward to and enjoy meeting with you all on a almost constant basis. No, I hope so. I hope so in a way that we can meet some of your earlier deadlines, talk about issues off camera, and hopefully Margaret will continue to bring donuts. Yes, sir.
Can you tell us if the president has ever had any personal experience that he spoke about in the last couple of days from his time in Cambridge when he was attending school at Harvard? Are you aware of any of that?
Not that I have, not that I've heard in the past couple of days, or that I have heard in the several years that I've worked for him. No, I think it was brought up yesterday when I was gaggling that there's a story in the Chicago Tribune from 2003, I think around the time he was working on the issue of racial profiling, that he mentions a suspicion of that, but not, I don't think it makes mention of a specific incident.
The president has referred to Professor Gates as a friend. Do you know how long they've known each other? And could you explain the nature of their friendship?
I don't know. I don't know how long they've known each other, or the depth of that. But I can certainly I can talk to the president at the end of this. Pam.
I was just wondering, do you know if the president has decided or not that he will sign a health care bill that does not have a public option? He's never said if that is a line in the sand.
Well, I think he has discussed in his principles the strong need to provide choice and competition, and his belief that a public option provides that for millions of Americans who, in different health exchange markets, are not going to have access to competitive plans. And I think he, as I said, outlined that in his principles, and
under increasing pressure about the public option, and that's why I was wondering if
yeah, it seems a lot of issues around healthcare that are that way. So, Wendell, I'll come back.
Based on my calculation, about half of the savings the president is counting on to fund 2/3 of the healthcare reforms come from Medicare and Medicaid. If you can follow my,
I think I do. Half of 2/3. I think I got it. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Much better student than me, obviously. Given that Medicare itself is in fiscal trouble, I mean, 2017, the trust fund expires, how can the president be counting on any savings from Medicare to expand the availability of health insurance?
Understand, Wendell, the reason it's going bankrupt quickly is the amount of money that is in the trust fund and the obligations with which that trust fund is being drawn down on. I think I've heard the president talk a lot about what the status quo means. The status quo means that we're going to continue to spend, or healthcare is going to continue to climb at a rate of roughly 3 times that, increase 3 times the rate of wages. That we can't continue to spend the type of money we're spending on healthcare and then not expect it to bankrupt our government. So clearly we have to put Medicare on a different spending trajectory. I think the president addressed the fact that on Wednesday, that the fact that he believed that we could do that without in any way threatening the quality of benefits, and I think that's why the AARP has come out in favor of health care reform, and why the pharmaceutical manufacturers and the drug companies have denoted that we can squeeze some savings out of the system and also put some money into actually filling the gap in Medicare that exists in Medicare Part D for seniors on drug expenses, and actually do it in a way that's paid for. which would be unique for that program.
Aren't any Medicare savings needed to save Medicare?
Well, again, if you are spending, if your obligations are less, you're going to by definition take a trust fund and draw down on it less rapidly. And I think it will extend the life of that and put it on a path towards sustainability that we all recognize is tremendously important. Yes, ma'am.
Blue Dog talks on healthcare reform have failed in the House Energy Committee. Can you comment on that?
Well, I think they continue to meet, so I think I'd be a little, I don't know that I'd rush to the fact that they've failed.
Ross came out today and said that they failed, that talks are impossible.
Well, I know they'll continue to meet, and I think everybody is, I know that the meeting that was had here at the White House that lasted 3 hours was seen as productive, and I think they'll continue to do that.
Robert, on healthcare?
Yes, sir.
Wednesday night, the president said the only way you get anything done in this town is by setting a deadline. With August 7th no longer seeming to be an operable deadline, would he like to establish a new one? End of September, a date in October? Would you care to?
No,
by Christmas? But seriously, I mean, is there?
Well, I will say this. I think
taking him at his word from Wednesday.
Right. I think. Look, David. I think that we have made progress in many ways because the president did, as he has said in interviews over the course of the week, poke and prod and set some, I think, what he would think of as meaningful goals for achievement. I think the president characterized the fact that Senator Reid's announcement yesterday was okay because he sees that we're making progress. He's in regular communication with members of the Finance Committee. He met with Senator Reid and Senator Baucus here at the White House today in what I think both sides thought was a productive meeting. Regardless of August, as I described this morning, we're going to we were always going to have to come back in the fall and reconcile legislation, go through the process again before something got to the president's desk. I think the president continues to believe strongly that we can see health care reform this year, this fall.
Robert, just
So does that mean that
one.
the House deadline, House passing before end of August is a nice thing
The
if
end
it
of
happens?
August, or-
No, the beginning of, before recess. So the House getting a bill by next Friday
Well-
would be nice to have, but not a demand at this point.
I think the president is encouraged as long as he and the administration and those on Capitol Hill feel like we're making progress, and that's where we are.
Would you see that bill passed if it meant taking it out of, sort of going around the Energy Committee because of the Blue Dog issue, or would,
I
at
haven't
this
talked
point?
to our folks
Robert,
on that.
just a
Robert,
clarification, one clarification.
He called on me.
Oh, yeah, sure.
You mean that's all I got to do is call on somebody else? I'm sorry. Go ahead, Mark.
And you'll come back to me.
Of course. How could I not?
Thank you.
Robert, what gave the president the impression that there was a media frenzy and his message wasn't getting through? He often says he doesn't watch cable news much.
No, but
you tell him. Did staff tell him you need to address this?
I was
it's
with
getting
him
out
yesterday.
Of hand.
I was with him yesterday, but the reports on cable TV were that this was taking up a lot of real estate.
Right. And you told him that? You let him know, or he?
A number of people, I think.
Did anybody on the outside about this issue?
Not that I know of.
So it wasn't one of these things where he was talking to an old friend or something?
Not that I know of.
And was there any discussion of him issuing a written statement rather than coming in? It's incredibly unusual what he did here today.
And missed the opportunity to see you guys?
I know he probably-
No, the notion that the president wanted to come, I don't know who's laughing back there. I don't think it was. If you laugh like that, we'll move you up to the front row. The decision to come in here and tell you all about it was the president's decision. Lester, let me.
And just for clarification, the president has actually apologized to that Cambridge police sergeant, hasn't he?
Lester, I think I answered this 3 times for.
Could you just tell us yes or no?
I feel comfortable with my answer.
Robert, on Baucus,
Go
tell us,
ahead. Go ahead.
tell us on
I'll come
Baucus,
back.
did the president leave the conversation thinking that, or confident that there'll be an agreement or something coming out of Senate Finance before August?
Well, I think that's the way Senators Reid and Baucus, as my understanding, have characterized the meeting, that they feel like they're making progress. And I think the president believes that too. And again, I think that's the president, as long as the president feels like we're moving in the right direction, he feels good. Mike?
The president noted over the last 2 days that Congress doesn't act unless there's a deadline, which he's got plenty of evidence to back that claim up over generations of congressional history. You put down your marker that you wanted to vote in both houses of Congress some weeks ago. You pulled out all the stops. You had press conferences, town halls, impromptu statements, and so forth. You were unable to meet that goal. At least leaders were unable to deliver. What is going to happen now over the course of August that's going to change people's minds and move votes?
Press conferences, statements, speeches. I mean, look, Mike, the August isn't being rejiggered to address health care. We always knew for months that we would be discussing this issue, and that it would be, whether it made it through the House or the Senate before the recess or after the recess, that the recess itself would be a critical period of time in which we would mobilize the president's voice in travel to address what he feels like is an issue that we can't avoid addressing any longer. I think you've heard him talk this week, describe in very personal terms what the status quo means. And I described it today a little bit as, on some legislative issues, the notion that if you don't do anything, if you don't get reform or improvement, then everything just stays where it is. Well, I think the president has taken the last several days to explain to the American people the status quo in healthcare means more people lose their insurance, families pay more money for their premiums, more people are discriminated against based on pre-existing conditions in trying to seek insurance. That's what doing nothing means. I think he'll continue to press the case for what doing nothing means, and continue to press the case for the principles that he's outlined to cut costs for families and small businesses, make it affordable, make it accessible. I think those are the things that have been doing.
Heard these arguments over the course of the last 3 and 4 weeks, and they're still reluctant to vote with the leadership, Democratic leadership.
Well, but again, I think, Mike, we, despite that, have had meetings here today that we think have been productive. I have no doubt that our staff will be working this weekend with committee members on the House and Senate side, as well as next week on making progress. I think the president certainly is a strong believer in the fact that you can continue to talk and work some of these issues through, that sitting down and having that dialogue is important to try to make that progress, and he's still optimistic that we can. Yes, sir.
Thanks, Robert. 2 quick questions. First of all, has the president expressed any disappointment that the outrage surrounding this, the Gates incident, has focused exclusively on his word choice and not on the circumstances of Professor Gates' arrest?
Well, I think the president. I think the president explained in his statement what he felt like he had unnecessarily contributed.
And my second question was, when talking to the president, has he ever talked about the contrast between the Senate leadership, the majority leadership under his administration versus under the Bush administration? Does that ever come up?
In what way?
In terms of party unity, that sort of thing?
No, I don't. I have not heard him discuss that. I have not heard him talk about that at all.
Swine
George.
flu. Can you give a little bit more of a readout on the Baucus meeting? Was it mostly logistics and planning and timetable, or was it also substance, talking about compromise?
It was, there was obviously committee process discussions, as well as it was told to me, issues of substance dealing with issues that remain unresolved in the committee. Sure.
In the last few days, he has expressed an interest in either taxing healthcare benefits from Cadillac plans or penalizing insurance companies that offer that. Did the president express still an interest in that, or even say he supports those ideas?
I don't know exactly whether or not that came up or in what form.
Clover?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. The swine flu. At least 300 people have died in this country from the swine flu, and many more around the world. How close are we to the medicine or to the shot or whatever they're going to have for, especially now the fall coming, and we have the other flu coming?
Right. Well, I know that there are regular meetings here at the White House hosted by senior White House officials, including John Brennan and others, to continue planning for what the president and his administration talked about earlier this year. That what we saw building up and that affected communities throughout the country and honestly affected countries throughout the world hit in many ways at the back end of our own flu season, which in many ways probably likely gave us the preview of the depth and severity of what we'll face come fall. We're taking steps, working with state and local officials, working with communities, working with school districts to ensure that they have the best information about what steps can and need to be taken to get ready for what we know is coming. Obviously, many countries around the world, we've seen a preview of the taxing nature that this is going to provide, the ability with which this is going to test our health infrastructure. And I know the team is working through the decision-making on and the development of antivirals or production for antivirals and developments for a vaccine.
What is the CDC doing, and what are they saying?
Their language hasn't changed much from in the spring. Again, when we faced this situation, there are a lot of things that we can and need to do to get ready for what we know is going to happen. I mean, in many ways, in some ways, we're fortunate that when we experienced this, again, like I said, it was at the end of our flu season. We're not likely to be that lucky in the fall, and I think the severity of the flu requires us to be ready at all levels of government to address what is clearly going to be a busy flu season. Thanks, guys.
Week ahead.
Oh, week ahead. See, I almost forgot.
Thank you for answering lots of people's questions.
I'm happy to do it, Lester. It's my job. Do what? That
Really fun.
yeah, but I noticed the attendance was kind of light for him today. I'm going to tell him not to take that too seriously. The weekly radio address is not surprisingly on healthcare, and I think there's a briefing call on that in about 20 minutes, and we'll have that out fairly shortly. The president will spend the weekend in Washington and has no scheduled public events. Obviously, you guys saw the guidance a little bit later tonight with the parade at the Marine Barracks. On Monday morning, the president will address the opening session of the first U.S.-China Strategic and Economic Dialogue at the Ronald Reagan Building and International Trade Center. Secretary Clinton and Secretary Geithner will chair the dialogue with the Chinese Vice Premier and State Counselor. Later, the president will meet in the Oval Office with the president of FIFA, International Soccer Body. Really?
What are they talking about?
What's the
dribbling, heading. Good point. No, they'll. I think the United States has a bid in on a future World Cup, and they'll discuss that.
Be in the meeting?
We just had it. you're a football fan.
South Africa for the opening game.
I know he wants to go, but I don't think anybody has confirmed it. Both of us do. Both of us do. The president will also really welcome the WNBA champion Detroit Shock to the White House. In the evening, the president and the first lady will host a reception for ambassadors. No details on Tuesday except attending meetings and an event here. As I mentioned on Wednesday, the president will hold events on healthcare in Raleigh, North Carolina, and a soon-to-be-determined city somewhere in the Commonwealth of Virginia. On Thursday, the president will meet with the president of the Philippines here at the White House and attend meetings at the White House here on Friday.
They're going to be a joint event.
I think we'll do something in the Oval on that. All right. Thanks, guys. Have a good weekend.